this webinar right now, and we will be also editing the video and uploading it to our website and over YouTube. It will be also shared with you via email, and it can be found also on the website. Now I will leave the, before I leave the floor to Mike, there will be an exercise where we will be going to rooms. So we will have 3 rooms, and when this exercise time comes, we will hear more about it from Mike. So let's be all prepared for it. And I leave the floor to Mike right now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Murad, and welcome everybody. Murad, can you just confirm you can hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
Great. Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us. Many of you, hopefully all of you, were able to go through, were able to attend the previous webinar we did with the on the overview of what the organizational cache readiness tool and process was about. And as mentioned, so today is really a deeper look at the tool. Murad, next slide. So again, today we are taking 2 hours, which is longer than was initially advertised, but we felt there was a need to make sure that we covered a lot of the content and had allowed time for people to ask questions, and we'll have some group work discussions as well, looking sort of diving into some of the nuts and bolts of the actual tool itself, the details of that. Next slide. So today's objective really is the hope that, having looked through we'll go through the OCR process and the OCR process guide, some of the content of that and how to use it. We'll dive in deep and look at the sort of the content and the structure of the OCR tool itself, which we can also see from if you have your instructions and other documents you have. And we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about some of the challenges and suggestions for how you might use it in your organizations. So we're hoping to get quite a bit of engagement from participants here today. Obviously, of course, there are a lot of us, so a lot of you, so we'll need to limit the amount of time and questions that we can handle. And once again, our moderator will be helping with that process a little bit. That's Murad, of course, and Martin with Kelt. So the format today will be once again going through some slides, talking about some of the basic content of the material and some of the as we walk through the various tools, various documents. But we will be trying to, as I said, have as much plenary and group discussion as we can. Once again, please use your Zoom chat to submit questions to the moderator, Martin, and he will try to consolidate those and ask questions of me, or present those questions to me as appropriate. When I ask you questions, please do raise your hand if you're able to do that. Either to answer my question or to show agreement with something I've asked. And again, Martin can help us assess the level of questions and the level of agreement or not. And once we will go into some breakout rooms. And once we do that, then please obviously respect others' opinions and respect others' desire to talk. But you will have an opportunity to speak more using your microphone. So hopefully that will be a useful, productive discussion for us. Next slide. So a quick recap of the OCRT. Next slide. Once again, the Cache Learning Partnership developed the Organizational Cache Readiness Tool to assist organizations in developing their readiness and their capacity for delivering cache. Cache or voucher assistance, CVA programming. Next slide. Next slide. Once again, there were 4 essential categories considered important for readiness for cache and voucher assistance programming. And these are the 4 categories that turn up in the OCR tool. So they are category 1, leadership and resourcing. 2 is organizational systems and policies. 3, looking at the staff technical competency for CVA. And finally, looking at the broad external engagement with stakeholders and the ability of the organization to engage and to manage that engagement. Next slide. Once again, and I hope now you've all had a chance to download these materials, because it'll be very helpful if you have these open in your computer or can access those as we go through and talk about some of these points, or a printed copy, of course, if you have that can be even better. So you have two screens at the same time. So that there are, again, as we mentioned, three basic components of the OCR process. There is the tool itself, the OCRT tool, which is the Excel spreadsheet with multiple tabs, one of them being for all of the criteria and indicators and detailed descriptions, and where all the scoring and information is all collected and gathered. Second tab being where various charts and such are provided. We looked at a little bit of that in the last webinar. The other two important documents are the overall process guide, again intended for the facilitator of the process, and a lot of what we'll be looking at today is basically taken sort of directly from that process guide. So you can please follow along, and if you have any questions, and as you review that as well, happy to talk through that. And then the other document is detailed instructions, which again go through the step by step, and has in addition some of the guidance for using the tool itself. Next. In addition to those three documents, there are a range of additional resources, additional templates that KELP makes available. I believe these are not yet on the website, but can be requested as support. So there's the various meeting agenda templates for the orientation meeting, for the scoring meeting, and the action planning meeting. And then there are templates for both what's called the standard action plan and the simple action plan. So again, very, very useful templates that can be used by an organization, by a facilitator. Of course, you can also make your own, but these are intended to help. We'll have a chance to look at those a little bit later. Next slide. So once again, the OCR process and approach. If you remember, next slide. If you remember, there were 5 key steps, 5 overall steps, including 3 crucial meetings. So the orientation and the orientation meeting, evidence gathering phase, the scoring phase, including a scoring meeting. From that, obviously coming out the recommendations, and then finally the action plan, including the action planning meeting. The first stage of that orientation, we'll talk about both we'll look at it as both at the meeting that takes place, but also the process for how you orient your organization and get buy-in from senior leadership. And then some of the key essential steps that are important there. But before we dive into that, I want to just briefly walk you through the process and the need for the different organizational buy-in. Next step, next slide. So the standard process that KELP suggests, and we broached this during the webinar last week. The standard approach is really that you have the entire organization being involved in this look at the capacity and readiness. So that includes your senior leadership, it includes your regional managers, if you have an organization across multiple regions, across parts of the country, your departmental managers, i.e. the different functional units, program, finance, security, logistics and admin, etc. All your various support technical staff in those various functional and in those various functional technical units, and your, of course, program technical staff in terms of all the various sectoral experts and so on. Ideally, you're looking through all 4 of those categories. All of those different members and different parts of the organization have different perspectives, and it's important that they contribute to this process and also, of course, benefit from in terms of identifying where the capacity and readiness is, where might some of the gaps be. So that's really sort of the recommended process. But again, it can be quite a full and extensive progress. Not all organizations maybe are ready or have the resources or the time to do that as a first step. Next slide. So a less preferred process, but a more targeted process might be where, for example, within a particular program area, within a particular project even, or a particular regional part of the country focused on a particular type of programming, or it's like, for example, the CVA programming in the humanitarian arm, they can focus on just the aspects that relate to their particular part of the organization. So that mostly would be involving, of course, still the support technical staff, because once again, effective cash and voucher assistance does require engagement from finance, procurement, admin, logistics staff, and security staff. So the support technical staff and the program technical staff would be leading this process and going through this process of looking at within the scope of that program, what are the aspects of cash readiness, cash capacity, CVA capacity that the program has. The 4 categories still, of course, apply, but would be most likely contextualized and adapted to focus on the points that are very relevant to that specific area of scope. Next slide. So once again, the process guide, one of the documents that KELP makes available, again, it presents a standard approach to the organizational capacity readiness tool and the process. But again, recognizing that each organization is unique and they may want to make some changes. One of the tools that KELP provides through this resource guide is what they call the process approach framework, to help organizations and facilitation team really think about adjustments that they can make based on the type of organization and the way that organization is structured. Next slide. So there's a chart or a tool within the OCRT process guide. It defines for basically 4 different approaches based on what's called the organizational match and the organizational mash. The process guide describes a little bit more detail what this is all about, but basically it comes down to match is how relevant the CVA is to the broad organization. For example, is CVA only used in a single humanitarian project, or is it something that the entire organization makes use of, including in its development programs, its resilience programs, etc. The match with CVA can be low or it can be high. Organizational mash refers to the way the organization is structured and manages itself in terms of, is it a very centralized sort of hierarchical process where all policies and procedures and everything are set from the center and implement outwards, or is an organization which would be a high mash, or is it a low mash where different parts of the organization have different capacities, different policies, procedures, different mandates, or different strategies for the kinds of programs or the approach, the activities that they're doing. And so obviously where an organizational has much broad need of CVA and where the organization is able to implement policies and procedures from the center, then a standard process, a standard approach can be used. The top right, where many of these workshops and such can be done collectively in collaboration with senior management and like headquarters or central office staff. If more of a low operational match where you've only got certain departments or where different departments have different mandates and different structures, then you're looking more at the bottom left, where you likely need to have consultations and meetings with each of the different teams and each of the different units. So there may not be one single set of meetings, those 5 steps. You may have to hold those 5 steps with each different unit, each different regional part of the organization, each different program. So obviously that makes a longer, lengthier process, but still requires the important need of an external facilitator. We'll leave it there. Next slide. Any questions, Martin? Any clarifications so far that have come up about that?
Nothing yet.
Okay. So here's a quick question for our participants. In terms of what are some of the likely challenges or the likely approaches that you might use in your organization based on the mash and the match of your organization, based on whether you think it's likely that the senior management has buy-in and would be interested in engaging this process, or where this is something that would at least initially focus on a small technical aspect of it. So maybe almost like a poll. Martin, if you can help us, because I can't necessarily see all of the participants easily. If participants are able to raise their hand or otherwise use a check mark of some sort, indicate how many think their organizations would be a high match and a high match where the standard process would work. Do we have any feedback from anybody? Martin, are you able to see any?
No. Yeah, no, nothing yet. Maybe if I could encourage, maybe another way to phrase the question is sort of as you've flagged on the slide, what are some likely challenges in your organization? Maybe people could type in the chat, what are some of the things that you're anticipating? Last week, a couple of kind of examples of what we spoke about or asked about is organizations that are actually federations. That might make it a little bit more challenging, or organizations that are very decentralized, right? So what are some things within your organizations that you feel would need to be addressed in the planning and preparation of using the OCRT?
Okay, great. So let's pose that question to participants, and everybody please go ahead and write a question, or what you would something like a question. What would you see as the likely challenges in your organization, okay, given what we've already seen? How are you doing, Martin? Are we seeing some?
No.
Nope, not seeing anything yet.
Like if I am planning to take this tool and introduce it to my organization and my supervisor, if I'm not the decision maker, what would be the challenge that I might face from your experience within your organizations and the whole field of the work? Mahir is saying any change is a challenge.
That's a good point. As we talked about last week at the intro session, there again are those three sort of windows that we need to travel through in terms of the organization needing to see that there is a problem in terms of dissatisfaction, seeing a clear vision for being able to advance, and then having a set of realistic steps that can do that. So yes, the first, any change is a challenge for people. Recognizing a need for a challenge is really the first step.
Martin, I see answers. Can you please go through them?
Yeah, I see one needs more clarification for a smooth shift, and then another defining match and mash will also be highlighted. And I think that's a good point about match and mash. To me, it's important to understand the concepts of match and mash and how this sort of fits in. Be aware. That said, it's sort of a conceptual framework rather than, you know, something crucial that everybody who's participating in the process needs to understand. It really rather informs your perspective and some of the steps that you might use. I would try to encourage you all to be sure to take some time within the process guide to understand match and mash. But in terms of actually then engaging others, those terms may not be crucial to make sure that everybody is always on the same page for them.
Yes, that's a good comment, Martin. It really comes down to, for the facilitator or the person that's interested in engaging in this process, is really trying to understand their own organization and where does it fall on those four aspects, and based on that's the approach they would then chase. But it's not a complicated or involved process. It simply says how broadly do we use and are interested in using CVA, and how consistently does our organization set its policies and procedures and strategies? Is it done centrally, or is it very much each project goes their own way? And again, the answers to those two questions will determine the kind of approach that you need to think about in terms of the scope, the likely scope of your process. But I agree. Yes, the terms themselves aren't necessary. It's a concept. Are there any further questions or challenges that anybody sees?
No, there's not, Mike.
Okay.
So maybe let's move on and we'll do. Oh, we've got one from Barack. He says that my organization using cash to deliver aid is a global goal, and therefore I may use the OCRT to strengthen the country office operations. I think CO probably means in this case. But what about those organizations that the headquarters has not yet fully bought into cash? All right. So for example, it may be for an organization that has relatively decentralized offices, and there's an awareness and understanding of what needs to be in place for effective CVA at the country level, but maybe there are still sort of policies or things at the headquarter level that's not necessarily there. How can we use that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, Barak. Thank you. So in a context like that, where you'd be looking at using this tool within your country office, and when it comes to looking at policies and procedures or resources or support or direction that would be needed from the headquarters, as the case may be, those are areas where you might identify gaps. And then so the recommendations coming out is not about what you as an organization need to strengthen in your country office, but it may be we need to reach out to headquarters and engage on this topic. We may need to ask headquarters to address this issue for us, and which itself may take the process of informing headquarters that you have identified this as an issue, and helping them to see if there's a need for them to move forward even with other country offices. So you can still do it certainly at your own country level, just recognizing that some of the issues may be outside the control if it's a headquarters type policy or resource that is required. Any other comments on that?
Nope, that's all.
Okay, let's move on. We'll have time for other questions as we go. Next slide and continue on. So we're going to look now at the first step. Step one is orientation. And as I mentioned earlier, there's two actual steps to this. One is the process of getting the buy-in and getting the organization on board and deciding what to do about the OCR process. And then the second is the actual orientation meeting and so on of how do you then do your agreed upon process. So the first step really is about outlining and agreeing the process. So that's where you're working with your organizational leadership, your senior management, or as at the appropriate level, as depending on again what your approach is, whether you're looking at it organizational wide or something more targeted. Either way, you're really wanting to introduce the leadership of that organization or a part of the organization to the OCR process and decide on what kind of scope. So what parts of the organization will need to participate. Again, is it just a single project, a regional office? Is it just a country office? Is it the entire organization? And how broadly within that organization? Defining basically the representation from those different parts of the organization and building a list of participants, people that will need to engage in that process. And again, they should represent the broad range of functions that are needed. Again, the operational functions like finance and logistics and security and procurement, as well as of course all the program and technical folks. And again, they should be people with both the power and the empowerment to be able to make decisions and make recommendations and create action plans, as well as the people who are doing the day-to-day job and the ones that can really assess how well is something actually being done. So you do need a range of people to be participants. It's important to agree a timeline and a level of effort. So how much time will this take for this process, and how much effort are we going to put into this process in terms of staff time and so on, because that can be an issue, and we'll come back to that briefly shortly. The critical part of this is also deciding on any contextualization or adaptation needed. And that's both for the process, as we mentioned, in terms of the scope, but also looking at the actual tool itself or the contents of the tool. So the criteria, the indicators, the descriptions. Are there particular ones that are useful or not useful? And how can they be adapted? And then finally, of course, defining clearly the role of the facilitator or the facilitated team. Making sure that that's in place and agreed upon and sufficiently resourced. Next slide. So determining the timeline and the level of effort, as we mentioned, it can take up to 3 to 6 months for this overall process, but it's important that you set realistic expectations about A, what time is available, and B, what level of effort is required and really can be committed. It's important to acknowledge that the organizations, of course, have existing obligations and workload that individuals have to do. So that has to be considered when you're scheduling the process and thinking about how much effort this will take. It's important to explain the rationale for the process length to all participants. So make sure people understand that it really should take 3 to 6 months and why that's important. And if there's a need to cut that back, what does that mean in terms of the compromises that would need to be made. It is important to allow ample time for coordination feedback between the various meetings, certainly between the orientation and the scoring meeting, because that's really the time you need to gather your evidence, but also between the scoring meeting, the recommendations meeting, and then the action planning to allow time for reflection, thinking before coming back together and saying, hey, yes, we agree to move forward, let's make our action plan. Next slide. Again, we mentioned contextualizing, and that really refers to customizing the tool for your organization, both the type of organization and the scope. So again, is it applying to broadly to all the organization or just to one program or one project? The standard tool has 55 indicators that need to be scored. So it's quite a thorough process if you're doing the full tool. However, an organization may only choose to use some of those indicators, the ones that are most relevant to the scope, or may choose to add some or to elaborate on some to make sure that you get the level of detail that you're looking for. For example, a typical contextualization is simply to use a standard tool, but to add a glossary explaining what the various terms mean in the context of the organization. So again, the terminology is important that everybody understands. And so interpreting the way you interpret the criteria, the way you interpret the descriptions, and even the way that you interpret the job titles being referred to, they can be contextualized to the organization. So you have a clear glossary of what everybody means. So you are all on the same page. Next slide. Once all of that is done, then really you move on to the orientation meeting. And this is a chance to really bring all those participants together and to make the plan for what needs to happen in this process. So again, it's really about communicating the vision, and hopefully you have senior management buy-in. What is their vision and objective for this process? And identifying, again, the organizational change principles, the fact that people need to recognize an issue, be dissatisfied with the current status, see a vision, have an action, and see possible concrete action steps. You want to review the tool itself, outline the process, validate the scope, make sure that your participants are in line and agree and can commit to the expected scope and level of effort, and then contextualize the OCRT tool itself. So again, looking at those individual indicators and descriptions and saying, how do we adapt this to our context with the participants in the process? And then the critical part really is developing an evidence gathering plan. So again, who's going to do what, and how long will that take, and what kind of documents are expected, what kind of evidence is expected, and then to define the process and protocols for scoring. So again, agreeing on how will the group come together, how will you interpret, and how will you assign scores to various parts. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the next session. Next slide. So once again, any questions from anybody in terms of clarification needed, and any ideas on likely challenges in your organization? Once again, in terms of really this orientation process of getting buy-in and then getting all the participants, all the right participants together to be able to set up this meeting.
Feel free to use the chat or to raise your hand. Mike, I've got a question for you. What's your sense of, and I think you touched on it already a little bit, but what's your sense of who should take part in the orientation meeting from an organization? Is it a large group, do you think, in general to launch it? Or is it really kind of a smaller team that's going to be hopefully pushing and advocating for it? What's your general sense or experience?
I would think the initial orientation process in terms of getting the organization on board, that's done with, again, your senior leadership and your managers, most of your functional managers. The orientation meeting, where you're going through the process, I think it needs to represent, it is relatively a larger meeting. I would be looking at 20 or 30 participants over a 2-day workshop, because you are looking at your ideally, your unit managers for the various functional areas and the regional areas. If you're looking at a countrywide office, a country office that has programs in multiple regions, multiple parts of the country. So you'd want representatives of the management of those organizations. But you also need the technical people, and you need some of the program officers, finance officers, people that bring let's say the technical skill to say yes or no. Yes, we understand this criteria. Yes, we understand this, what this evidence would be and how I would go off and find this evidence. So again, it depends on the type of scale of the organization, but it needs to remain a manageable number of people.
Right.
So, the initial phase can of course be explaining to everybody what's going on, but when it comes to actually doing the work of the orientation meeting, then that needs to be groups that can work on various parts of it.
Right. So it sounds like the actual number really isn't necessarily so crucial, and that can really depend on the size and the scope of the organization and all. But what I'm hearing you encourage us all to think about is to be sure that a cross section of the organization is represented, especially because different parts of the organization are going to be particularly well placed to gather some of the evidence or some of the documentation that's going to be useful for the scoring. And so you want to get them involved as soon as possible or as early in the process as possible. Is that it?
That's exactly right. Yes.
Great. And I see a good comment in there. The timing is also key to get the participation of critical people. It's not at a time where it's the end of year report or some major event happening going on, right? And I think, Chiambi, if you want to speak to that last one, I think that's a really interesting comment, your final sentence. Do you want to turn on your microphone and share that?
Yeah, so there was a time I was trying to do this with one of our country offices in my previous job. And I think trying to get the critical people in the room can be frustrating, especially, like if you're looking at head of units, for example, and you want them to be there because these are issues that are coming from the different units of an organization, and you don't get the right people. So sometimes they just send representatives that are not very conversant of the issues, and then you don't make progress. So that's why I'm saying it can be frustrating if you're not having the right people or the key people in the room.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is you want to be sure that you've got a base of kind of understanding and interest and commitment sort of at the outset, so that when you have the orientation meeting, the right people are in the room sort of endorsing it and that are going to be able to make some decisions to move some things forward. Otherwise, there can be a sense of, well, yeah, this is all great, but we're not going to be able to do it unless this or this or this, right? So that is a key part. Thanks.
Yes, and I would agree, and that certainly agree that is one of the frustrations, and therefore that's why, as you say, it's so important that the first part of this orientation is really about getting the right people on board, including getting agreement from the participants you've identified to get them to come to the orientation meeting and to commit the time. And as mentioned, it may well be a 2-day meeting that needs to be thought of quite far ahead to make sure that the right people can get it into their schedule and are willing to come and commit to that full time, because it is quite a process. Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, it's important to be realistic in terms of what you can hope to achieve in these processes, and certainly in terms of the first process. And again, as necessary, it can be somewhat of an iterative process. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah, so sorry, Mike, if I could just respond. Barack poses a question I think is really a great idea. He asks whether CALP is planning to develop a lean executive material that can be used to manage time in order to manage the challenge that Shyambi mentioned above. So sort of, you know, an advocacy one-pager based on this information in the process guide and in the instructions and all. We hadn't thought about that, but I think this conversation, that idea is really a good one, and I think we should make note and perhaps consider making that. So thanks for that idea, Barack. But we don't have one at this point.
Okay, great, good, very good suggestion, like an executive summary and an executive guide for how executives can oversee and guide this process. Okay, let's move on. If there's no further questions. All right, next slide. We're going to look at the next step. The next stage is of course evidence gathering. This is again a very essential process. We described this already in the first session, but really the entire process should be evidence-based. So you've had your orientation meeting, you've identified what kind of evidence is necessary to gather, and then you all go off and gather that evidence. So when you come to your scoring meeting, when you come to defining a score, getting people to agree on a consensus of what the score is, defining what recommendations would be, and building action plans. That really should once again be based on evidence, not simply on opinions. So, you know, there will be, of course, as always, there will be a range of opinions and a range of thoughts on that process that you do need to find a compromise. But again, using evidence as best as possible will help justify these types of recommendations and will enable organizations for senior leadership to buy into the recommended actions if you can show that there is evidence to back it up. So it's a very important step. Next slide. In the OCRT process guide, there's a chart like this which gives a sample example of lots of different types of documentation is possible to collect. The key thing, once again, is through your process is really thinking around, for any given indicator, how in my organization, what kind of evidence would we need, who would collect it, how would we, you know, once we get to a scoring, how would we assess that, how would we summarize that evidence to really assess. But the types of documents range. So under leadership, you've got organizational charts and strategy documents. You've got emergency preparedness and contingency plans. You've got your various types of financial and fundraising reports. Category 2, your organizational systems and policies. These are all your policies manuals, your procedure manuals, whether it's finance, procurement, etc. You've got all of your, obviously, CVA documents and guidance and procedures that you should be following. You've got your various financial reports, your budgeting, your staff job descriptions in terms of, and your staff development reports and processes, training programs, recruitment methods, and recruitment reports, all the types of things that can speak to how well your organization has in place its policies and procedures, how well they are known about, and how well they are followed and complied with, and of course, and what happens in terms of enforcement and addressing change. So all those things are required. Staff under category 3, staff technical competency, obviously looking at the reports of the projects in terms of what the projects were able to do, what staff were able to succeed at doing based on their knowledge and skills. Looking also what kind of training is being provided to staff, what kind of, once again, in terms of their evaluation of projects, evaluation of the success or not of projects that can tell you about the level of competency, as well as, of course, of looking at individual staff in terms of HR reports and HR summaries of performance of your individual staff members. And category 4, external engagement, you're looking at the types of communication strategies, what kind of publicity and documents does the organization have, what are its advocacy practices, and how broadly it reaches out to other stakeholders. In our case, of course, including things like the clusters, the cash working groups, the donors, and implementing partners, and obviously authorities and so on, in terms of how do you engage. So again, once again, there's a range of documents that can be provided and are important. Next slide. In the for those of you that have your tool open, your OCRT tool, in the data spreadsheet, the main first spreadsheet, in addition to all of the categories, the criteria, the indicators, and the detailed descriptions, you then have columns for the score, for the degree of consensus and the action that relates to the degree of consensus. And then there's a column for evidence collected. And that really should be filled in by the team or the individuals that are gathering and consolidating the evidence. And that can be, ideally, it's a summary of the evidence that has been collected, but you can also include the source of the evidence in terms of the specific name of the document or the name of the person who was spoken with as the source of the evidence. But it's critical that you have at least a summary of what the evidence says for any given criteria, any given indicator, because participants will really rely heavily on these when it comes to deciding on the score. Your participants won't be able to read through all the various evidence provided. That obviously is impossible even in a two-day meeting. So what they'll be looking for is summary of the evidence, possibly backed up verbally by somebody presenting it or clarifying any questions on the evidence. And based on that, the participants will then decide a score and the reason for their score. Some organizations use a good practice, for example, when they have summaries of their evidence collected, the bullet points, then there can be multiple bullet points for each indicator, that they already in a way identify which is positive, which is good evidence for good practice, which is evidence for a lack of good practice or potentially a poor practice. So like a positive sign, a negative sign. So again, by having those types of tools or quick tips that you can do with the summary of evidence collected, the participants can then look at that and much quicker get a sense of how you're doing on a given indicator. So that's a very important practice. But once again, key point is the evidence you collect has to be already summarized and ideally already reviewed in terms of, does this represent a strength? Does this represent a weakness? So that then at the scoring meeting, then participants can decide on a final overall score for that particular indicator. Next slide. Once again, any questions and clarification of that? Okay. The question again, likely challenges in your organization, particularly in terms of evidence gathering. What would you see as being challenges in your organization for finding the right documents or finding the people with the right documents and being able to bring those and summarize those to a meeting? What would people see as challenges? No comments?
I can
no
share
questions?
a thought. I can share a thought here, Mike. I know that some people have spoken to one of the challenges that often comes up with this type of evidence gathering about what the organization does, or what information they have, that kind of thing, is if there's a lot of staff turnover, it's harder to find where that sort of institutional memory is for things of, that talk about what we've been doing in terms of staff capacity, what we have in terms of background standard operating procedures for how we used to do things, and to be able to start to see how things have changed and how things are moving forward. That's sometimes one of the challenges that people face or organizations face.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And any other comments or questions on this from the participants?
I raised my hand. Maybe Martin has not seen it. This is Barak. I was just wondering, when collecting this evidence, I've seen quite a list of documents and what one should be looking at these evidences. So what happens in a situation where you have limited of those? It's just like a very tiny representation of those documents to show that the organization indeed is trying to, in terms of putting a footprint on cache programming, but then they don't have sufficient. Is there any concern, or that should be used to now plan how to develop the capacity of this organization in cache programming?
If I understood, if I understood the question, you're saying that there may not be a lot of evidence available. It's difficult to get that evidence. And I see a comment from somebody else as well.
Yes. You've understood my question well. That is what I meant. Yeah.
Okay. And the second, there's also a comment from somebody saying, if no evidence or not enough evidence is collected, how will this affect the whole process? And those two are related. Obviously, if you cannot find evidence, then in a way that itself shows a gap, of course. And so when it comes to the scoring meeting, and you're looking, for example, at a policy, or maybe it's a HR policy, if you weren't able to lay your hands on, or easily lay your hands on a policy, then obviously there's a gap. Yeah, there seems to be a need for a documented policy. Or maybe the policy was in place, but nobody seemed to know about it, couldn't find it. You've still got a gap. There's an issue there to be addressed. So in a way, the lack of evidence answers your question for you already in terms of where some of the capacity gaps and the readiness gaps may be. And obviously the recommendations coming out of that would be develop and disseminate appropriate policies. So the lack of evidence doesn't prevent you from coming up to a score, as long as it's a fact that the evidence didn't exist, not simply that, well, I wasn't able to have the time to find the documents, or I wasn't able to meet with my HR manager to provide that list of documents. So it's important to understand why you were not able to find the evidence. If you think the evidence is out there, but you simply just didn't have access to it, it wasn't provided, you can still proceed with your scoring. Obviously, it won't be as fruitful, but then more likely your assessment is going to be, well, we struggled to get this evidence, so we're not sure if this information is in place. So you are likely then to be not able to give a definite score, but you can say there's a sense that we could be, we could have this in place, but it's not clear. So we're likely to score ourselves down, and the recommendation being find the policy, find that documentation, find that evidence, and then make adjustments as needed. So again, lack of evidence can be a symptom of a lack of capacity, obviously, or the lack of ability to find that evidence means that you can't be as definite or certain in your scoring. But again, that can be accommodated within the process of the tool, and we'll look at that in a little bit in the next section. Does that answer your question, Barak, and others?
Oh yeah, fine. Thank you very much, Mike. It's clear now.
Great. So, Murad, next slide. Okay. So, having done the evidence gathering process, the step 3 is now once again coming together with the scoring meeting. Actually, it's step 3 and step 4. That's a typo, sorry. It's coming together with a scoring meeting, and then coming out of that, step 4 would be then creating the recommendations. So we'll look at both of those a bit together. Next slide. So the scoring meeting, as I said, one of the three essential meetings. It can be face-to-face, it can be virtual, and again, it may well be a 2-day meeting. So again, it's quite a considerable level of effort and commitment required. And again, it should involve all the various participants, the relevant participants, again, across the functional and the geographic and the programmatic areas of the organization based on your agreed scope. And so again, there is a template, a scoring meeting agenda that's available. But basically, it's covering these 4 points. You're looking at each of the indicators in the tool, looking at the detailed score descriptions of that, and then looking at and discussing the summary of the evidence that's been collected. Again, ideally, it's already pre-filled into your spreadsheet, and as necessary, sharing any additional relevant evidence for the indicator and/or clarifying what the evidence is, or the background to the evidence, and/or clarifying if there was a lack of evidence for some reason. So a discussion on each of those, and then the group, whether and it can be done in plenary, it can be done probably more productively in group work, like sort of functional group work or area people looking at specific parts of the tool, and deciding on and proposing a score for that category, or for that indicator, and overall for the category. And then obviously through a process, depending on how you facilitate the meeting, you can have those various groups also share and discuss the proposed scores to end up, because you want to end up having some level of consensus on each of the scoring decisions. And now that consensus may be that yes, everyone agrees, or you may find that no, there's a lot of dissent, hopefully productive dissent within the groups on how to score. And that itself, that level of consensus is itself an important point to note and to report, because that also tells us much, both about what the recommendations and next steps need to be, and about how you might need to proceed then on that in terms of when it comes to later action plans. The next slide. So again, in the OCRT materials, there is a little sort of cheat sheet chart, which explains why degree of consensus it is important to note. And in the OCRT tool itself, there is a column called action, which is not the same as the action plan, but really talks more broadly around what to do about your degree of consensus. And so it looks at on the vertical your score 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 being of course high, 1 being low. Your degree of consensus from left to right is low, where people basically don't agree. Some think yes, we do well. Some say no, we don't do very well on that. Too high, where everybody agrees yes, we agree on this score. If there's a low degree of consensus, then it's important to be investigating more and finding out why is that consensus. Is it simply that you don't have the evidence, or you don't have the information, or not enough people are aware of that information or capacity? So you do generally need to investigate. It may simply be that you need the people who do know, and the experts on a particular indicator do know, but haven't communicated that fact to the broader organization. So the action may simply be to communicate this to the broader organization, so that they are aware of what is being done well, where there's lack of knowledge about that. Obviously, if you have already high degree of consensus, then it really depends on what your score is. If you're scoring 3 and 4, then obviously continue and do a bit better. If you're scoring a 2 or a 1, then obviously there's a need to improve that area. So your basic action is yes, we need to improve this, and then from that would then be developing what your recommendations are, and from that on to the action plan. So again, just a simple tool lets you think about what to do about the level of consensus and what it means for your actual score and how to interpret your score. Next slide. So once again, in your scoring tool, in your spreadsheet, they have after the score and the degree of consensus there, you now have columns on the reason for your score and your recommendations. Where am I looking? Sorry. The next slide. So the recommendations are, of course, just basic statements of what should be done. It's separate from your actions in terms of what, in terms of who does what when, in terms of the action plan. The recommendations simply would be to fix whatever is broken or to put in place whatever is missing, and obviously being as concrete and specific as possible. So certainly looking to the detailed descriptions, for example, of the indicators can tell you, give you a guide of what's missing, therefore what needs to be put in place. The reason, when you're looking at the reason for each score, why have people said, you know, I've given us a 2 because we don't have that policy. We can't find that policy. So obviously your recommendation would be find and or create a policy and disseminate the policy. So again, a simple recommendation. Any indicator with a low score, of course, a 1 or 2, needs to have 1 or more clear recommendations. Higher scores may not need recommendation other than simply continue and or do better if we can. Again, depending on the level of effort that is available. The challenge, as always, is to find a balance between ideally a small number of relatively high level statements put in place as HR policy, and what could potentially be a long list of detailed statements in terms of starting to blur the line into an action plan. So it's important to try and keep the recommendations basic, high level, and focus, but still focus specifically on what the description says was missing in terms of what should have been there that was not. Next slide. Once again, any clarification of any of that? And if no need for clarification, once again, what are some likely challenges in your organization? So picture yourself in this process now where you've gathered evidence, you've brought your team together. You may have a room full of people for a day or 2 to be doing this process. You're a good facilitator, or you've got a good facilitation team to help through this process. But what are some of the challenges of getting participants to reach a score, to agree on the level of consensus, and to agree on what recommendations need to come? What challenges might you see in your organization or more broadly? Again, please use the chat function to propose your question.
I see that Barack has raised his hand. Sorry, I missed it last time. Caught you this time, Barack. Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Martin. I feel it's sometimes easier to speak than to write, such that those who are not able to see the chat can also hear. So I think on this particular section, consensus sometimes is one of the biggest challenge in terms of, is one thing that is very difficult to arrive at, especially when you find people defending certain positions. Like, for example, a certain department may want to defend themselves and present themselves as not pulling back the organization. So how should we go about moderating on this such that we can have a consensus build in a more understanding manner rather than different units trying to hold on certain positions?
Thank you, Barack. That's a great comment. Really, that comes down to facilitation skills. I guess the sense of the room in terms of what you set up for expectations in the room and how you facilitate that process. But certainly, it's a challenge in terms of if individual functions, individual groups have an agenda or have a particular opinion on something and may not necessarily agree with others, or necessarily being flexible about accepting what potentially could be conceived as criticism. So I would say the key point as a facilitator of when you're doing this process, and again, this is hopefully where you have senior leadership to give you the backup and support, is to approach this as saying, this is not a criticism. This is not us criticizing our finance team for what they do or do not do. This is not us, criticizing the program project. It's really, it's a self-assessment for all of us, both in our functional or programmatic areas, but then more broadly to discuss and see how we can learn. So that it's really important to have that kind of mindset and the encouraging and promoting that culture of participating and being willing to ask questions, being willing to take constructive criticism. And then obviously the facilitation process is about how well you manage that. But recognizing there will always be certainly personalities, challenges in how you work with individuals. There will be often very valid concerns that functions or teams might have about willingness to admit to issues, because that may create problems for them. Or sometimes the opposite, they're wanting to point out where the challenges are so that they can obtain the resources or the attention to a problem. So there may be an incentive for them to ask for support. So it really is, it comes down to facilitation. Yeah, but certainly those are some of the challenges.
Thanks, Mike.
Mike, if I could complement your response there, which I think is really valuable, is one of the approaches that I might try to use as a facilitator in a situation like that is to try to be as practical and as action oriented as possible. So rather than allow the conversation to sort of stay focused on the differences in perspective or potential conflict, it's to try to move the conversation towards, okay, we see things differently, but are there things that we agree on that we can take steps towards doing? So it's getting us to be looking forward, and hopefully the conversation will be as such that we're able to come to decisions of what we want to act on together. Would be a way that I might try to facilitate it. I see that Chiambi has a good question about whether we work with homogeneous teams or mixed teams. So for example, should just be leadership working on on category 1 and so on. And I think the response to that is, in general, we would like to try to have mixed groups as much as possible. Sometimes that's not necessarily feasible because of where people are housed or different activities that are going on. But certainly you want to try as much as possible to have perspectives from across the organization looking at things, because someone within leadership might say, yeah, we definitely have a policy on that. And then somebody else will say, I've never seen that policy. Is it available? Or, yeah, we have a policy, but it hasn't been updated in 7 years, kind of thing. So it's useful to have another perspective. If I could also take a moment just to step back and sort of rephrase one of the things that I think about in terms of the evidence gathering and then the scoring and recommendations. To me, I think of those very much as assessment and analysis, where we're really saying, okay, what kind of information is out there? What kind of data can we collect in terms of an assessment that is going to tell us some things about these categories, all right? So evidence gathering is really about collecting data. It's about assessing what's going on. Then we come together and we have to say, okay, we have all of this evidence. We're starting to see some trends and what it means, but we're asking ourselves that analysis question of, what is the data telling us? What do we see here about ourselves? And then what are the ways that we can be looking at that to take some action and make some recommendations for moving forward? So even though we don't necessarily use the terms assessment and analysis here, it's very much what I see is happening, and it's an approach for us to really think about, okay, what do we have and how are we going to act on it? I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you, Martin. Yeah, no, certainly I agree. The idea is to try and keep it practical and focus on what do we do, what do we don't do, not what, don't get into debates about why something is in place or why something is not. It should be straightforward. It is or it is not. That's the scoring. And then the other way to keep moving on time, I guess, is to remember that you don't have to reach 100% consensus. If in fact not everybody agrees, that's perfectly okay. You just need to note that down. So again, in terms of facilitating, if there are individuals or teams or units which disagree on a given score, that's fine. Just note it down and say, okay, the scores range from a 1 to a 4. There's a level of divergence. Let's note that and move on, and not spend all the time trying to convince each other. Again, it's not about opinions. It's about ideally evidence. Can you show something's in place or can you not? And then based on that, you move your scores and so on. Okay, but thank you for those comments, those questions. Next slide, Murad. So what I'd like to do now is just go in and look at some of the actual descriptions. So in terms of what are we actually talking about when we say the ability to score 1, 2, or 3, or 4 on something. Obviously, we have as we've talked about within the materials there are the 4 categories, and then each of those categories have criteria and indicators. Next slide. And each of those indicators have detailed descriptions. So the OCRT instructions document describes both the tool itself and outlines again the steps for using it. And then it also includes like snapshots of some of the, it includes snapshots of all of the categories and criteria and the relevant descriptions, the detailed descriptions. It's not what you're using during the meeting. Obviously, during the meeting, you're gathering everything in your spreadsheet. But during your scoring meeting, you could be using the instructions as the reference document for reviewing and assessing. Yeah, because it does include them all there. So we're going to quickly take a look at the category 1 of leadership, and just to get a sense of what it looks like and how to maybe how to interpret it, and then we'll break out into groups and have each of you try and contribute and look at a discussion on different parts. Before we do that, I would ask everybody, if you have hopefully downloaded the documents, that you do open your OCRT instruction document, the one that's shown on the screen here, and if you don't have that, at least the tool, so you can be looking at the text there. So that in breakout groups we can talk about that and not simply be trying to do it through a very large slide pack. But let's start with the category 1. Next slide, please. So category 1, as we said, leadership and resourcing. There are 3 criteria: leadership, change management, emergency planning, and funding. Each of which then has the various indicators. Next slide. So under criterion 1, for example, and apologies, this is rather small text. Again, hopefully you can see it in the document that you have open, rather just looking at the slide here. But once again, there are 4 columns representing the 4 possible scores, and so taking simply taking an example 1.1b, senior leadership. A score of 1, senior leadership discourages the use of CTP, in this case CVA, as a modality. So if it's obvious to participants in the room and/or by what the senior leadership says that they're really not very encouraging of CVA, they don't see its value, they don't prove that by showing support or encouraging or committing resources or staffing to that, it's very clearly this is a gap, this is a problem. Looking right across from 2 to 3 to 4, you're basically building in or building on that to say, well, yes, there's some senior leadership allows for the use of CVA as a modality, but it's not quite sure. Moving to 3, senior leadership is generally supportive, but again, doesn't necessarily fully engage. And 4, senior leadership actively supports CVA as a modality and gives leadership and accountability to its implementation. So you can see the descriptions for each of your indicators are written in a similar manner, where level 1, something is not in place, it doesn't exist, no one's thought about it, you can't find it. 2, 3, 4, 2 being yes, it's sort of there potentially. 3, yeah, it's in place but needs work, or it's not fully fully online, and 4, everything's up to speed. Everything basically meets what would be considered good practice for an organization with good capacity and good readiness for CTP. Next slide. Similarly, criteria 1.2, change management. So again, things like we've looked at the leadership support. If we look at 1.2b, again, change agents, again, no. So an organization, in order to be ready, have capacity and be ready for cash, it needs to have, for example, change agents in place. It needs to have change plans about how they're going to build capacity. Again, doing the OCRT is somewhat part of that process. So this is a little iterative in that you need to have the process in place to understand if you have the capacity. But in order to make change, you need to also have done the process and done the tool to see where the gaps are. But so again, it's looking at an example of number 1, no processes or teams in place, through to number 4, a team's been appointed and empowered. So again, there's senior leadership buy-in. It's in place, and there's senior leader buy-in. So these types of criteria and descriptions can be taken on all of the different criteria. Next slide. A big one around emergency planning, and again, this is obviously very, very concrete. If we look at 1.3a, emergency preparedness, so that gathering evidence, for example, this is relatively straightforward. You say, A, is there an emergency preparedness contingency plan in place? If there is CTP, or sorry, CVA, an important part of that? Is it recognized as a potential type of modality that your organization may use? Yes or no? It may be there, but only being a very small part. So it exists as one option, and that might score 2. The score of 3 is where CTP CVA is a critical part in terms of it's a preferred modality, or it's a default modality that's used, and it's a fully in the emergency plan in terms of all the preparedness and resources and action plans in place, contingencies to be able to use CVA effectively. And so for scoring 4, it's fully integrated into all the emergency preparedness plans and strategies, etc. So again, the similar things are happening on those. In the instructions material, the instructions booklet, it also includes, so again, it includes the snapshots of the descriptions, and you could use those for review and of course during your meetings. It also provides some guidance. So for some of the indicators where there's a question or different ways it can be interpreted, there's an opportunity to read and review some of the guidance. We won't go through in detail now, but there's a range of useful guidance. The key thing for you as a facilitator, if you're potentially going to be a facilitator for this process, is that you of course yourself understand what these criteria and what these score descriptions represent, that you understand where there might be challenges or lack of clarity among your potential participants in terms of questions coming up of, what does this mean? What do you mean by this, or how do I interpret that? There might also, of course, be questions about, well, we have this policy, but not that policy. Does that mean we're 2 or we're 3 or we're 1? So again, to be reflecting on these as part of your preparedness and through this process, reflecting on these and saying, okay, how would I help the participants to address these types of questions? How might we resolve whether we're a 2, whether we're a 3, given based on the amount of evidence that has available. And finally, of course, is of these various criteria and of the various indicators, are these relevant to your organization? You don't want to come to a scoring meeting and be sitting and spending time looking at criteria indicators that are not really relevant to your agreed scope. If you're focused on a very specific part of the project, part of your organization, many of these things may not be relevant. Depending again on the structure, whether you're a country office, whether you're a regional office, whether you're a headquarters, a global headquarters, the interpretation and use of these descriptions also might need to be varied, might need to be contextualized. Again, as simple as doing a glossary or doing more detailed. So as a facilitator, it's important to be able to do that. Any questions before we dive in and look at a bit more detail?
Mike, there was a question that I missed earlier. It says, if there's clear evidences that confirm or does not confirm specific indicators, why do we need to proceed with scoring and consensus? I think the scoring should be applied only for indicators with no or not enough evidence. And what do we think? Okay, well,
I would say the scoring is essential for all of these indicators. And if we look at the descriptions of 1 through 4, to be able to state whether and to be able to give a score requires on having evidence and on having reviewed evidence. So if you've confirmed that there is no evidence for this point, then almost by default you probably score 1. So you don't need to then go through and read number 2, read number 3, read number 4, and debate them, discuss them. Obviously, if you say, well, we really can't speak to any of these, then we're a score 1. But it's not necessarily that clear cut. Again, on some of these descriptions, you may not have one policy in place, but you might have a very good policy on a different aspect, which is still relevant. So you might have to decide, well, here it says some. Do we want to consider all or none? How do we interpret that? But it's important that yes, you do have a score for each one. Simply having lots of evidence, having a lot of policies in place doesn't necessarily mean you have the capacity if those policies aren't, for example, fully understood and fully complied with on a regular basis. And so in the example you'll see, looking at your policies and procedures, many of the scoring for 3 and 4 say not just that a policy is in place, but that yes, people know the policy and people implement and comply with the policy on a regular basis. Yeah, and you can't necessarily do that simply from looking at whether a policy is in place. And there needs to be a discussion of that evidence, of the existence and knowledge about that policy, for example. I hope that answers the question. Martin, you want to jump in?
Just to add a little bit about the notion of consensus there. To me, the value of clarifying where you are in consensus is useful because it tells you whether you're ready to move towards action. If there's high consensus on where you are, then you're ready to say, okay, now we're ready to act. What are our recommendations to act? But if there's low consensus, then that might be telling you, you know what, maybe we need to learn a little bit more about ourselves in terms of this indicator so that we have wider agreement of where we are before we figure out what steps we might want to take. So there's value in that. Again, I think as I was trying to say earlier, you don't necessarily want to get caught up in the circle of discussing conflict or different perspectives. You do want to try to move towards action, but to have a sense of whether there is consensus does help you be able to do that. I see Barack has his hand up again.
Thank you, Martin. Mine is just a quick question, and thanks to God that this slide on emergency planning and funding is available. I think the indicators, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know the structure of other organizations. The indicator 1.3b, 1.3c, and 1.3d, in most organizations, these are HQ indicators. It's HQ that usually holds the reserve funds for emergency TP response. So I don't know whether when we are asking this question at the senior management, it would be trying to understand whether they have knowledge, whether that kind of fund exists, or it is good time we think to adjust these particular indicators under emergence to reflect the situation in country office rather than having the indicators that only HQ is able to respond to.
Yes, that would be again, good question, comment. that would be an example of where you're contextualizing to your organization, to your scope. I would say that at a country office, you still these four criteria four indicators do still apply, but it may be that you have funding available, but you have to seek out from headquarters to get that funding. So you may score not that you don't have funding, but that you don't have the autonomous funding, and it's something that you need to reach out to headquarters for. So an action point might be a recommendation might be well, can we get something pre-agreed in place, or streamline that process, for example, to improve our access to rapid funding. So for CTP, do we need to advocate for something? So yes, as you say, yes, the indicators may need to be adapted and tailored to the scope of your context, but don't simply scratch them out. Do first review them, and including working with like a team or your leadership to say, is this relevant to us? How would we adapt this to make this more relevant? Over.
Thank you, Mike, for that feedback. Yeah.
Other comments or questions from anybody? Do we see Martin?
Nothing else in there, but certainly welcome to have other comments.
Okay, please do, anybody. Keep the comments, questions coming. Okay, what I'd like, so Murad, next slide. Murad, next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is take a little bit of time and have us break out, if we can, break out into some breakout rooms. Ideally, again, all of you have your documents in front of you, with you, so we can refer to those as possible. The facilitators will share screen within their breakout room of the instructions document that we're looking through, or the tool as appropriate. But what we want to do is really look through for your assigned category 2, 3, or 4. Look at the criteria and the score descriptions, the criteria, the indicators, and the detailed score descriptions, and just briefly discuss, ask questions or briefly discuss. Do you see in your organization, for example, would you see a need to contextualize that? The example just given of a country office saying, well, these are headquarters, we wouldn't necessarily do that. Have a brief discussion about these on the various indicators we'll see for your category. Obviously, is there any need to clarify any of these descriptions? Do they not make sense to you? Do you have a question about how you would clarify it for yourself or your participants? And critically looking at what kind of evidence do you think would be useful to gather for these type of things? Is it a policy? Is it a report? Is it speaking to somebody, interviewing a stakeholder? What kind of evidence do you think would be possible or needed to gather for these things? If we can ask facilitators, and if we can ask maybe one of the participants in each of the groups to take a note and kind of prepare to give us just a very brief, not even 2 minutes is necessary, just a very brief key points, kind of report back when we come back in plenary, that'd be very, very, very helpful. Let's just take 10 minutes to do that, a very sort of brief discussion, and then we come back together to compare notes and move on to the next step of action plan. Murad.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, Murad. How are you?
How come we were 6? Now we are 4.
You left others outside.
No.
Bring them in, or maybe they have left because there are other participants who had left. We were 23. Then I saw we were only 20.
I'm trying to see. So, please, can you initiate the conversation? People are not joining.
Hello, Aham and Tisibehi.
تمام
Okay,
تمام أيهم and Barak.
Oh, okay, okay, fine, thank you. Oh, Aham cannot speak. She's in public. Oh, she. Okay, I don't know the name, but he
Ayham
cannot.
is he.
Oh, Aham, he cannot speak because he's in a public place.
Yeah.
And the T.S. Behi.
Yeah, this is the mom. Yes.
Oh, okay, fine. So we can talk now. So
Okay.
what is the point, Murad? We don't have any material to make reference to.
You didn't download the materials for the OCRT?
Oh, no. I mean, it's here. We can download. I can do it right away. I think I have it, yeah. So, OCRT, let me go to. Let me check.
Hammam, Ayham, have you downloaded the tools materials?
Yes.
Perfect.
All right, OCRT.
So our group will be talking about the policies.
The policies.
Okay.
OCRT instruction. So we will be talking about the policies.
Yeah, organizational systems and policies. Yeah.
Okay. So which will be the main important tool to use here is the Excel sheet?
Yeah.
Okay. CTP knowledge.
So the Excel sheet, the Excel sheet is the tool itself where we need to do the scoring for each of the different categories.
So then which document now do we need to open for reference to policies? Because here we have leadership in these, in the Excel, we have leadership, we have emergence, change management, CTP competence policies. Is that the section?
Yeah, let me, exactly,
just
the policies section.
The CTP number 2.1, 2.1.
2.1.
Okay. So then we
All
can
of them.
delve into.
So Barak,
yes.
if you open the Excel sheet, all of you, and now in our group we have also Mehmet. Welcome, Mehmet. So, and Yiktithan, I hope I said the name right. So if we open the Excel sheet, you will find it labeled in blue. So category 1 is leadership and resources. If you go to line 19 on the Excel sheet, you will find category 2, organizational systems and policies.
Yes, it's here 2.0.
Yeah, within this one, we are having the most aspects among all the other categories. So first one is CTP technical competency policies.
Yeah, okay.
Second one is CTP technical competencies guidance, finance and operations, program development and contracts, knowledge management, and then human resources. So when we look at the systems and policies, we need to look at all these 6 subcategories. And under each of these subcategories, there is also subcategories. If we look at the technical competency policies, there is assessment and analysis, design and implementation, monitoring and evaluation. The idea is not to make it complicated by having like categories, then subcategories, but then we have another sub for the subcategories. The idea is to be specific as much as we can, so we can give the right marking for each of the aspects we are trying to focus on and study, and see where are we and what is still needed to be done, and then we would reach the high level. And this is when, between the medium and high, this is where we have more preparedness as an organization to start implementing CVA. Is that clear?
Yes.
Sorry, question, Murad.
تفضل تمام.
Okay, so for CTP technical competency policies, and the first indicator is related to assessment and policy and analysis.
Assessment and analysis.
Yeah,
منظمتك.
as far as I know, that assessment and analysis is something related to any type of programming. So why do agency will have a specific policy for assessment and analysis?
We need to have a look and to know more about what type of assessment this organization has capacity to conduct, and what type of analysis they are looking for after they are done with the assessment. You see? So
yeah, even in the scores meaning, for example, if you go to score 1, there is no for example, there is no policy in a place defining who and when to conduct the various situational and response option.
exactly. This is when they get one.
Murad, I think the word policy is a very strong word to use here, because what we have in many organizations are procedures. They are like steps. Before you do a proposal, there is ABCD steps. We have the flowchart, we have the roadmap. But policy is a very strong document that outlines certain things, and I think this is now where if you may allow us to also give feedback to CALP to go and adjust some of the terminologies used in these indicators, because policy, I think, I am just trying to reflect here in CARE. I work for CARE, my colleagues who don't know me, and I'm just trying to look at, do we have really a policy? But when it comes to procedures or steps to be undertaken, then these exist, but I may not call that policy.
The idea is the first thing that CALP welcomes always any type of feedback and comments. So you are welcome now and later on, Barak and everybody else, to send us anything you feel that we need to work on or like change. The second thing, I totally agree with you, Barak. But at the same time, when you talk about policies, when we are talking about policies, we are trying to include all the lower levels under that. So it is okay, but maybe we need to have another look at it. But don't be strict to the word policies, guys. Yani, let's look at systems, policies, previous experience. Yani, all this will come through the work.
And even Murad, this applies to other indicators, design and implementation, monitoring and evaluation. So here we are talking about project cycle management or
Yeah.
project cycle. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the link between the criteria in column B and the indicators in column C is not clear.
There.
I don't know if
Come
other
again.
colleagues agree or disagree with this.
Come again with your idea, Tamam.
Sorry?
Come again with your idea. You were referring to some columns here.
What Barak mentioned for the first indicator applies on indicators B and C.
B.
Design and implementation, B.
So Timam, what we should do is, because Murad has explained that we should not tie ourselves to the term
To the
policy.
literature.
Yeah, so we will that may be considered in the future, or they may explain, they may give additional explanation that policy is just any procedures that exist. So right now, let's look at procedures. Let's replace the word policy with the procedures in our mind, whether those procedures exist.
Okay, and don't forget that this tool is being used by local organizations and regional organizations and international organizations. So some people might have procedure while others might have policies. Okay?
Yes.
But when we talk about assessment and analysis, this is the indicator, okay?
So
let's forget about the criteria. Let's focus on the indicator itself. Assessment and analysis, or design and implementation, M&E tools, procedures in place. What do I have? How they are prepared to work in a CVA context. This is what I need to focus on, the actual indicators themselves.
So how do we move forward now that we have agreed that we don't dwell so much on the terminology? So the next step is, because Timam, yourself, myself, we come from different organizations.
Yeah, sure.
So how do we move forward?
Would you like to start the scoring? Let's take a subcategory and then we start talking more about it from your organizational perspective.
Okay, so for example,
sorry, Barak.
Okay, go ahead,
The scoring will be different because we are talking about different organizations here.
Exactly.
That's why we can agree on whatever that is similar to most of the organizations inside the group, and then we can do that. And Ayham, if you can also please contribute to the conversation within the chat box.
Okay. So, okay. Now, we didn't even have the introduction to know from which organizations we are. Me, I'm from CARE. I know Murad is from CALP. And then the rest, maybe we should just say from which organizations we are, whether they are national or international. Then we can.
Can you guys start telling us from which organization are you coming from?
Hello.
Hi, Tamam. Yes.
Hi, I'm Yiğitan. I'm from World Food Program. I'm national staff. I'm CBT officer.
Great.
Ahlan. Tamam.
Tamam, Oxfam, Syria, AFSVL advisor.
Okay, and Ayham is from Ghiras al-Nahda. I think.
I'm Mehmet, and I'm also from United Nations World Food Program.
Okay. So then I think this one is easier because I know Oxfam, they have policies. I know World Food Program, they have policies. I know CARE, we have policies. And I just want to wish that Aham was able to speak. Then that way we would have known whether the organization has these policies. I think for this group, it will be easy, most probably that we can just score and have a consensus. I know WFP, I know Oxfam, They are movers of cash program in the globe. I know CARE, we are doing this. So how do we want to, can we just take one organization and share the screen and we work on that? For example, I'm willing to write if it is okay with you. I can share my screen.
Yeah, please, let's do that, Barak.
Okay, allow me to share the screen now, the rights to do
and
that.
Let's not forget that we only have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, quickly. Murad, allow me to share my screen.
Yeah.
Murad, before we go into details, I just have one question, quick question. Maybe it's not relevant, but so there are different types of organizations, from really small ones to the international ones. But I mean, is it really, how can I say, is it really useful to use this metrics to identify their point, whether they are small or big? I mean, is there a specific grading with regards to the grade of the organization? Because for a small organization, let's say maybe having a policy, something really good for them, but it's really bad for an international organization to not have any policy. So I guess the grading should be also different in this case.
Yeah, of course. That's why we were asking about the different organizations, and we wanted to have one example because, of course, the scoring from an organization to another will be different. And I think Barak wanted to take CARE or Oxfam. This is what you were suggesting?
Yes, because now all of us, we will never have one score because we are coming from different organizations. So I volunteered to take an example of CARE. So we can all discuss differently, but I'll just be scoring for CARE, what exists in CARE as an example, you know.
Guys, do you agree on that?
Yes,
sure.
yes, please go ahead.
Colleagues, I'm sorry for calling you guys colleagues.
No, we are guys. We are all together. All these humanitarian people, they are guys. They are
yeah. All right. Yeah. So let's start. Let's start from subcategory 2.1.
Open the screen sharing for me such that I can share as we fill out.
I'm trying. You cannot still. Okay, I'll try to make you a co-host, maybe. It's not letting me.
Okay, so okay, let's just discuss.
Let me share.
Or you share. Yeah. Yes. Let's share and use yours. Yeah. Okay.
Can you see it now?
We can see yours. Yeah. Tamam. So go to the first tab. We start with the CTP assessment and lesson. Down.
Okay. Here we go.
So at CARE, if we are looking at CARE as an organization, we have a policy in place defining who and when to conduct various situation and response option analysis. What this means is that before we do any cash programming, always we have to do a market assessment and also a food security assessment. It is, we call it a rapid needs assessment to see whether the markets are functioning and what are the food consumption scores at that place. So
sorry, Barak, I'm trying to have like us scoring at least the subcategory 2.1. So let's go with these quickly. Like 2 examples on each would be enough.
Okay, so that is number 4 for assessment and analysis.
Okay.
Also in design and in implementation, we have a policy in place. We know who does what and what. So in design and implementation is also number 4. Then monitoring and evaluation, we also have a full meal unit that is responsible for conducting PDMs and even the complaint and response mechanism. So that exists. So as far as CARE is concerned on CTPs is 444.
Thank you. I will kindly ask IHAM, as they are a national organization. How do you see or where do you see your organization in terms of in terms of scoring. If you can share these with us through the chat box quickly, Ayham. And for the moment, I will be closing all the rooms. And see you at the plenary. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I see that we are 10 participants for the moment.
Hi, Murad. I hear you well. Yep, and I see my group is back in.
Yeah, but I don't see Mike's group.
Okay, they'll be coming soon, I'm sure.
Okay. 244 for these from Ayham. Yeah, thank you, Ayham, if you can hear me.
Okay, so we're all back hopefully in our main room.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I'll leave it to you, Mike.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Let's go quickly. Maybe hear from a few folks about if they had some interesting discussions there. I'll start just very quickly. Some of the questions that came up when we looked at category 2 was around what do we mean by the IT systems? What do we mean under financial? What do we mean about the accounting codes? So clarification around that. And looking at knowledge management, recognizing that knowledge management is a process of how do we collect, use, and share knowledge and guidance and documents and policies, as opposed to the actual presence or not of a policy or a guidance manual. So that's a sort of a distinction between technical capacity and materials in place and the ability to share and use the knowledge effectively. And again, in the guidance documents, it does give some bit more descriptions about the IT and about the finance and so on. From other groups, other breakout groups, do we have any a quick what areas of discussion or challenge?
Yeah, I think we have went through the subcategory 2.1 from two perspectives: an international NGO, which was CARE, and the second one was a national NGO, which is Ghiras al-Nahda. And I'll leave it to Barak from here.
Okay, so thank you very much, Mike and Murad. When we were looking at this, number one, we had quite a lot of discussion around the terminologies used here. For example, we said the word policy is a little bit stronger for probably an NGO to define what policy is. So we were requesting that maybe we should use or have a legend defining what policy means, what falls under the category of a policy, because we said most organizations, they have a flow chart of how these activities happen. Others, they have SOPs, that is the standard operating procedures around this. So that was one of the main points that we highlighted. But for CARE, we did say that we have these procedures in place, and we scored at 4 in assessment and analysis. We usually have very clear procedures. Before we start any cash program, we have to undertake a market assessment and also a rapid needs assessment. Then during design, we know who should be involved. It is clearly defined, the stakeholders at the design and implementation. Then lastly, we looked at monitoring and evaluation. CARE has a system in place under the mill department that monitors the cash programming through PDMs, the complaint response mechanism, and all that. Unfortunately, to our colleague Aham from the national NGO, he was actually out. I think he's driving and he's not able to speak. So he could not give us what is at their organization. But this is an example of CARE. So we cannot give you everything on this particular category, but just that one example.
Great, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a very common situation, I think, where the larger NGOs, particularly the international NGOs, do have quite detailed standard operating procedures and such in place. The question there really is, okay, it's great, it's in place. Is it, but once again, is it known to everybody? Is it used by everybody? And is it effective in terms of, is it the right policy so that it has the right
Mike,
impact?
Aham has just sent the scoring. So he says at the organization, the assessment and analysis is at number 2.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about individual organizations here. Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Thanks, Brock. Yeah, but the key point is that yes, having clear SOPs, policies, procedures is important, and international NGOs generally do have those in place. But you will find, and I agree, a lot of smaller organizations, especially a lot of national or local NGOs, often do not have those policies and procedures in place. But that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily effective. One of the things, just very quickly, you find is, again, organizations can have a policy in place, but nobody knows it, or it's not used, or when it's used, it's not really effective. Other organizations may not actually have a documented policy or procedure, but the staff know what to do. And so they always do what is really needed and can be effective. Both of those approaches, have their obviously pros and cons. Ideally, what the OCRT can be used to do is to, when you're assessing your organization, looking at both aspects, saying, okay, do we have them documented, and how can we get them documented, and then how do we make sure that we're doing the right thing consistently? So again, it's looking at both having the documents and being able to use them for the appropriate effect. Yeah, and so that's important. But that's a good point, saying yes, different organizations have different approaches. Martin, just quickly, did you have any?
Yeah, I think we focused on the category 3, staff CVA technical competency, and it has 3 different criteria and a number of indicators. And we acknowledge that the criteria are linked very much to the project cycle. So to us, there wasn't a lot of needed clarity in terms of what the indicators were and all, but it did have more to do with thinking through how one organization might approach things differently. So for example, it was flagged that an organization might not do the needs assessment or a market assessment on their own because they might be able to get that data from the market assessment from another organization or another source. So they may recognize that we don't need to build that capacity in our in-house. So we talked a little bit through the scoring. Well, they might have a low score for that, but the rationale or the reason that gets recorded is we choose to not need to apply resources that way. Rather, we're going to build good relationships to be able to access that data elsewhere. We also talked in terms of overall where to gather some information, and obviously staff that are involved in program is a source of information. We talked about the value of reports, what went well, what needs improvement, to be able to look back and to get a sense of where we have capacity. We talked about training reports to know whether staff have participated in training, or we as an organization have organized training on behalf of our staff, things along those lines. I think that's a relatively quick summary.
That's great, thank you. And that's a very good point. Again, in terms of contextualizing the tool, it's saying what do we actually need to have in place for this? Is this something that's relevant to us? If it's not, you modify it. You do, yes, every organization needs to be able to base program design on market assessment data. But as you say, they don't necessarily have to be gathering the data themselves. So the question is, becomes more, do we gather the data? Do we use it effectively? Do we incorporate it into our design? Yeah, and so you modify your criteria and your descriptions that way, accordingly, again, based on evidence. So thank you. That's a really good summary. In the interest of time, I know we are at time. I'd like to just take a few more minutes, if that's okay with people. We do need to get to just quickly the last step. Next slide. All right, next slide. So obviously the final step, once you've had your scoring meeting and you've agreed on the scores, you agreed on the recommendations, the next step really is looking at the action planning. There are a series of tools that KELP makes available, including an action planning meeting agenda and an action planning template. which is quite a thorough document. Again, it's important to contextualize the document to your organization, to the scope, whether you have something with dozens and dozens and dozens of different action points for each indicator, or each category, or whether you have a couple of key essential actions that you'll be doing as a priority sort of for your next, let's say, for your next phase. But it's important at least that each of your action plans does have sort of the six basic elements. Identifying for your recommendations, try to gather them under or cluster them in terms of are they relevant to the same part of the organization or the same team or unit within the organization. For example, these all fall under finance, for example. So finance will do a series of points. Procurement logistics might do a series of points. The meal team might do a series of points. Senior leadership. They link somewhat to the 4 categories, but they can also mix and match depending on obviously who has what responsibility for the various parts. But it's important to cluster them. And then each of those clusters as needed have sub-clusters of action in terms of which part of the unit, what aspect they're working on. But again, trying to keep the action plan and the action planning template, keep it relatively short and focused. But it's important that also that you trace and note the links back to the very specific recommendation and the very specific indicator. And that's important. So when you do hold your meeting, and again, it may be a 2-day meeting for action planning, you want to develop the action steps for each of your subclusters or each of your key points. You want to identify who's assigned to do the task and what the timeline is. But you want to make sure that each of them, again, references and links to a specific indicator, so that you have the evidence of why that action step is necessary. And when you come to say, well, that action is now done, you can refer back to that specific indicator and say, well, does that change our score? And certainly one hopes it has changed your score for the better by that point. Again, there's a lot of different action planning documents that can be incorporated. You try to collate them all into one overall action plan that you can share with the leadership team. And then you should be able to present the outcomes, including the action plan, to executive management for their approval, and obviously critically resourcing for implementation. And as we mentioned last during the webinar session, one of the great aspects of the OCRT tool itself, the Excel file, is on the second tab. It has all the graphs, so it's able to graph for each of the criteria, and each of the criteria will show a graph listing the score for each of the indicators. And similarly, each of the categories will have a chart listing the scores for each of the criteria. So depending on the level of audience that you're presenting to, senior leadership would be interested to know how you score overall on some of the key categories, maybe some of the key criteria, whereas where the individual teams or their respective functional units would be interested to see the much more detail of how you're scoring on each actual indicator. And so that's a useful process, for a useful tool for being able to share information and then use for tracking. And the last step, of course, is really coming back at the end of your action plan and saying, well, okay, so these action plans have been done. Have we now made the improvements that we thought we had? And so ideally, again, this being an iterative process, ideally you come back at some point and you're able to reassess and rescore at least the ones that were critical actions were needed, and say, have we improved? Have we moved from a 1 to a 3 or a 2 to a 4? Have we made some positive improvement? So in the interest of time, we'll leave that there. Are there any final questions, burning questions from participants? Are you seeing any, Martin, are we seeing?
No, I'm not seeing
questions?
anything.
Okay. Okay, well, once again, we'd like Murad, you've had a chance to do a quick poll. Or Murad? we'd really appreciate for participants if you could quickly fill out this poll. Did you find this useful? Was it well done for your needs? And critically, we're really interested to see if you think you have a better sense, a deeper sense of this tool, and do you now have some more confidence to be able to take this tool forward within your organization? We're certainly hoping that we'll see some of you, at least, in session webinar 3, where we'll look at again a deeper look, but at the MENA context, Middle East, Near Asia context, and how would we contextualize the process, the tool, to the the facilitation, let's say, to the sort of the cultural, social, organizational context within the MENA region. So once again, thank you everybody for your time and attention, and I do hope it's been useful for everybody, and I hope to see some of you at webinar 3.
Thank you all for your participation, and we will be sending the link for the third webinar the day after tomorrow. I'll be sending that tomorrow to all of, not to all of you, for people who works in the MENA context. And for those who don't, we want to thank you for your participation in this webinar and the previous one. And again, we as CALP are there for you, so please share with us any comments and any questions on the tool, and we will be supporting what you are trying to accomplish. Thank you all, and see some of you the day after tomorrow.